I'm making a hairpin for my niece on her birthday. I think it will be convenient to use a single coil for this one, and I've chosen a wide coil for reasons that will become apparent later. I'm starting slowly to establish the point. I want it to be square in cross-section, and if I'm not careful, it'll have kind of a diamond cross-section, and that will cause me trouble later as I work. Having established the point, I'm now extending for a longer taper, still with a square cross-section. A little bit more work on the taper to get the full length I'd like. Now I'm twisting as I hammer to round up the cross-section. Here at the tip, I'm hammering somewhat randomly. I'll work up and down the corners of the cross-section in the thicker areas. I'm hammering lightly and rapidly while slowly twisting the stock. This is going to produce a smooth, round surface. When you deform steel in some way, it springs back up to a certain point. If you deform it farther, it stays that way. That's the yield point. When steel is heated up, the yield point is dramatically reduced, and that's why we can forge it. But still, a little bit of the blow is lost, overcoming the yield point. And I'm taking advantage of that. The light blows do not deform the steel where it's already relatively flat. But anywhere there's a peak, the blow is focused on a little bit of metal and it yields. Next, I bend the tip over. Pokey ends are bad ideas, and the traditional approach to dealing with that is to curl the tip back. Unfortunately, I've started developing a little bit of kink here, and it's going to take me a bit of fiddling to work that out into a nice round loop, but I'll get there. Now I flip the piece around and do the same process again on the other end. You've already seen this part once, so I'll speed it up. This second curl is actually on the opposite side of the steel. One goes up and one goes down, so to speak. And the reason for that will become obvious once I bend it into an S shape. I accidentally didn't record this next part, so I've grabbed some scrap and I'm recording the same step again so you can see what I'm doing. With traditional fire-based heating, you can't help but heat up the loop at the end while heating next to it. So, you quench it in some water. But, with an induction heater, I can just avoid heating it in the first place. It's important for this next step that the loop be relatively cool. Then, when I hammer on it to start the bend, it doesn't collapse. So that's how I started the bend, but I didn't get it recorded in the first place. Now we'll jump ahead to what I did record. I've made 2 loops of the S, but they're not quite as balanced as I'd like. Oh, and now you can see why I picked a wide coil. Oops. So what I'm doing now is I'm fiddling with it to balance it out. Then I also lost the recording of closing it up, but closing it up is relatively obvious. What I'm really doing here is working on getting both sides to meet in the middle, essentially. If I made these often, I'd have a bending jig that did this for me. It does kind of look like I'm moving backwards, and I sort of am because I'm unwinding to rewind a little tighter or a little looser to balance things out. Then I'll just tighten them both up. Now I need to curve it so it will reach around some hair and can then be pinned. It's a little fiddly to get the free end to accept the same curve, but I can get there by working back and forth. And now the same thing for the other side. And one final tweak using my cone-nosed pliers. Now I polish it up with a wire brush. This removes most of the scale, which would otherwise flake off in use, and gives it a nice shiny surface. We also need a pin, so I'm starting on the handle end. I want to make this a loop, and to do that, I need a smaller anvil. Fortunately, I've made one. It's a little fiddly to get a nice centered circle, but working back and forth, I'll get the loop just the way I want it. And then I will trim it to the right length. I'm going to put a decorative twist in this pin, and for that I need a square cross section so that the twist will show. It's not strictly necessary to use a power hammer to do this on little stock, but I did want to show off my new toy, or tool. It's actually both. That ram that goes up and down is 40 kilograms or 88 pounds. But this kind of power hammer has pretty delicate control. So I can work this thin stock and get the exact effect I want, even though it's pretty big and powerful. The pin needs a little bit of a taper on the end, kind of a gentle taper, just enough to make it go through hair well, but not be very pokey. I leave it a little bit square, but I take the edges off because I don't want them to be sharp. I'm going to twist in one direction from the pointy end to the middle, and then in another direction from the handle or loop end to the middle. That makes for a nice decorative element. I have a toaster oven in my workshop, and I use that to heat my work up to about 250 degrees so that I can melt Carnauba based wax on it. This is actually a floor wax. but it makes for a pretty good finish. And I'm going to melt this on, and then I'm going to use a rag, one, to hold so I can work on the other end, and two, to wipe off the excess wax. And now the same thing for the S part, but I figured out, having done the pin with that red rag, that the red rag left fibers stuck to the wax that I then had to clean off. So I've grabbed an old t-shirt for a rag, which works much better and doesn't leave fibers stuck to the work. Finished. Happy birthday, Liz.